Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name's Bastani. Stick around after the stream this evening. We're doing a very special Q&A on the rise of reform from 7:30. That will be with Ash Sarkar, Michael Walker, and myself. Joining me for the next hour, though, is Kieran Andrieu. Kieran, how are we?
Aaron, I'm very well. I'm a little bit tired, but I am certain that the adrenaline of the next hour will carry us through. And how are you?
I'm pretty well. I'm not tired because I've got a very sore throat and I have basically ingested my body weight in highly potent throat spray just so we can do this show tonight. If I'm out after 30 minutes and I've been replaced by Stephen, don't be surprised. I'll try my best though. Coming up tonight, Israel has completely destroyed Sanaa airport in Yemen. Labour is weighing up a U-turn on the winter fuel allowance cut. And Friedrich Merz becomes the first German politician to lose a parliamentary vote to be chancellor. Israel has completely destroyed Yemen's main airport, in the latest in a series of strikes on the country. The smoke rose over Yemen's capital of Sanaa today after Israeli fighter jets bombed the city's airport. 3 civilian airplanes, the departures hall, the airport runway, and a military airbase under Houthi control were all targeted. The Israeli military posted this description of events online. The airport served as a central hub for the Houthi terrorist regime to transfer weapons and operatives, clearly underscoring the Houthi terrorist regime's brutal exploitation of civilian infrastructure. Furthermore, several central power plants were struck in and surrounding the Sanaa area. These plants were exploited by the Houthi regime for energy infrastructure and for the construction of underground tunnels. Kind of nonsense, guys. The real reason for the attack was revenge. Revenge for the Houthis' humiliating attack on Israel's Ben Gurion airport near Tel Aviv on Sunday. This was the moment a hypersonic missile fired from Yemen struck inside the airport's perimeter, causing panic in Israel's capital. Despite billions of dollars spent on the country's air defenses, the Houthi missile evaded Israel's Iron Dome and other missile defenses, coming within meters of destroying its major airport and meanwhile injuring 8 people. That's a major breach of Israel's security and one that makes Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government look like they're asleep at the wheel. It also results in multiple international airlines suspending flights in and out of the airport just weeks after they'd resumed following a ceasefire deal. That ceasefire deal was, of course, binned by Israel, who quickly returned to genocide in Gaza. That didn't stop the planes, though. Only the Houthis were able to do that. Of course, the bombing of Sanaa's airport wasn't Israel's only response to the Houthis' surprise operation. Overnight on Monday, Israel attacked 10 sites across Yemen, with a focus on Houthi concrete factories and the strategic Red Sea port of Al Hodeida. Residential areas were also reportedly hit in the airstrikes, with 42 people injured and 4 killed. In response to the airstrikes, the Houthis have vowed to escalate their attacks on Israel. In a statement, the group's political bureau said, quote, "Targeting Yemeni ports, Sanaa airport, cement factories and power plants aims to impose a blockade on the Yemeni people." And they pledged that the assault would not, quote, "deter Yemen from continuing its support for Gaza." Israel's attacks on Yemen come just a day after the government's approved a plan to seize and occupy the entire Gaza Strip. That was despite warnings from the military's chief of staff that the move could result in losing the remaining living hostages. The Israeli government believes there are still 24 hostages alive in Gaza. And today, one member of Benjamin Netanyahu's government went even further. The country's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has promised that Gaza will be totally destroyed within months, with the entire population, quote, concentrated in a narrow border area. We're talking, of course, about more than 2 million people. I'll say that again. A senior Israeli minister has promised to, quote, concentrate the Palestinians of Gaza in a narrow strip of land. Smotrich also said this. The Gazan citizens will be concentrated in the south. They will be totally despairing, understanding that there is no hope and nothing to look for in Gaza, and we'll be looking for relocation to begin a new life in other places. Quite extraordinary. We're talking about open conversation, proposition of ethnic cleansing. Palestinians in Gaza have endured more than 18 months of murder, injury, displacement, and loss at the hands of a completely unchecked genocidal state. And the announcement of Israel's most depraved plans to date has naturally left many with a complete sense of hopelessness. Reuters reports this from Gaza. For Aya, a 30-year-old Gaza City resident who returned home with her family during the ceasefire after months in the southern part of the Strip, Israel's announcement on Monday raised fears of being killed or indefinitely displaced. Are we going to die this time, she said in a message on a chat app. Are they going to displace us again? Are we going to end up in Rafah? And will this be the last time? Or are they going to force us out of Gaza after Rafah, she said, referring to the Rafah area in southern Gaza, which is, of course, next to Egypt's border. Attending a funeral on Monday for several people killed in an Israeli airstrike on a building in Gaza City, Mohammed El-Sakaleh said things were so dire it was hard to comprehend Israel's plans to intensify its assault. This is him speaking. There is nothing left in the Gaza Strip that has not been struck by missiles and explosive barrels, and there are still threats to expand the operation, he said. I'm asking in front of the whole world, what's left to bomb? Speaking to Channel 4 News after Israel approved its new and explicit plan to seize all of Gaza, Jan Egeland of the Norwegian Refugee Council identified who bears responsibility.
It's a total collapse of international diplomacy, of global solidarity, of sanity. But listen, the United Nations are nations supposedly being united, and it's the US, the UK, Germany, and the Gulf countries that have influence on Israel. And they are not doing what they should do, and thereby they bear responsibility for this cataclysmic suffering, where the Israeli hostage is part of the suffering. But listen, too many thousands of Palestinian children have already died totally needlessly.
Yeah, we're looking at least 16,000 Palestinian children being killed over the last 18 months. And I find this extraordinary. We've talked about Yemen. We've talked about Gaza. When you hear about refugees, displaced people coming to Europe, you hear about Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians, Afghans, Libyans. And for anybody with an ounce of common sense, you can join the dots between Western foreign policy, intervention, occupation, sanctions, failed states, and people coming to Europe. It's pretty obvious, right? They're not coming from Dubai, folks. Okay? They're coming from countries which are viewed as being at odds with the Western order. I just listed a bunch of countries. Two places I haven't named are Palestine, Gaza, and Yemen. Yemen has a population of around 40 million people. Sanaa is a very large city. Very few of those people have come to Europe because of displacement, because of war, because of famine, because of, conflict. Even though there was a massive war in Yemen, spearheaded by the Saudis. Maybe the West is trying to complete the set, right? Maybe it's like Pokemon. Got to catch them all. We've done the Afghans. We've done the Iraqis. We're strangling the Iranian economy. We can go further, folks. We can complete the set. It's like a Panini football sticker album. We just need to get the Yemenis and the Gazans to come to Europe. Maybe the Gazans can go to Egypt. They can create a failed state there because Egypt doesn't have the capacity to deal with 2 million displaced people. That itself is a country of more than 100 million. And then we've completed the set. We've quote unquote defended the West by making the whole of its near abroad a complete chaotic shambles. Makes you think. Sadly, though, the right often in these debates between foreign policy and displaced peoples, refugees, they don't seem to join the dots. Kieran, those were very strong words from the Norwegian Refugee Council. The gentleman speaking there a moment ago, Jan Egeland, I believe it was, said that ultimately the likes of the US, the UK, the Germans have real influence with the Israelis. They can stop this. They're choosing not to. Can you see that changing? I mean, we're just seeing a constant expansion in Israel's war efforts, now including Yemen. Let's be honest, this is effectively a declaration of war against the state of Yemen. Where does it end? I mean, are they just going to be able to start these wars with literally everybody with complete impunity?
Well, I think the first thing to stress, touching on what you just said, is that Yemen and the Yemeni forces are doing what every other Arab state should be doing for the Palestinians, which is to say standing up for them. That's the first thing. It's doing what the grassroots Arab populations everywhere have always wanted their leaders and governments to do, i.e. counter Israeli occupation and regional aggression and counter US imperialism by extension in the region. And in reference to what you were saying, Aaron, and in reference to what the spokesperson was saying, if it isn't too much of a suspension of our reality to say this, actually, the Yemeni forces and Yemen is and are doing what the international community really should be doing, which is to say, using limited judicious force where everything else has failed to prevent an active and ongoing genocide. I mean, when you have government ministers openly saying we're going to concentrate 2 million people in a small area after bombing them back into the Stone Age and genociding them, and now saying we're going to end the place, we're going to level this is the end now, and we're going to essentially put them in a concentration camp, invoking his own words, the international community has an obligation to act with force if everything else fails. Of course, it's not. It's aiding and abetting, and it's profiting from. So actually, I think the most important thing to stress is that though they are cast as international miscreants, the Yemeni forces are actually doing the work that the international community, if it were functioning properly, would be doing. As I say, as much of a suspension of our reality as that is to say, I think it is absolutely true. I don't see the international... I've spent the past 18 months trying to find reasons for hope. And I'm not going to sit on this show and tell everybody that there's no hope and that I think one day Palestine will be free. I don't know how and I don't know when. It's an incredibly nebulous thing to say because it's going to be a very, very complicated process that may get worse before it gets any better. But one thing I am fairly confident in is that there is very little hope of Western governments as presently constituted getting involved and doing a kind of volte-face or reverse ferret at this moment in time after allowing Israel to carry out atrocity after atrocity after atrocity with total impunity. With total impunity. And not just impunity, with, as I say, the aiding and abetting and the profiting from of Western governments. And just as a side point on Yemen, this is, I think, another piece of evidence as to how the claims that that Israel is the kind of client state of the US that the US has lost control of, and it's now acting as a on its own volition is wrong. It's wrong. They have a geostrategic symbiotic relationship, and at the present moment, in the context of Yemen, that takes the form of tag team bombing the country, bombing Yemen. I don't know where all this ends. The Palestinians have always known Israel to be a menace to Palestinians. Sorry to say it, but it's true, and there's no other way to put it at this point in time. I don't think there's any point in circumlocution anymore. The Arabs in the region have always known Israel to be a menace to other states in the region and to their populations. And Arab governments are by no means angels, but Israel has been turning that entire region into a powder keg for nearly a century now. And I don't know where it ends. I'm sorry to say, Aaron, I just don't.
While it was the Conservatives who came off worst in last week's local elections, Labour also had a punishing few days. They lost the Runcorn and Helsby by-election just while finishing fourth in local elections for the first time ever in the post-war era. That was, of course, behind Reform, the Liberal Democrats, and the Conservative Party. Their vote share was down 14% on last year's local elections and 9% on 2021, when these same authorities were last contested. In Hull, where Labour has 3 MPs, they came fourth in the race for the Metro Mayor. I wouldn't want to be one of those 3 MPs. In Durham, meanwhile, the party lost 34 councillors and is now down to just 4. Reform are now the largest party in Durham, with YouTuber Darren Grimes potentially the authority's kingmaker. From YouTube and GB News to King of the North. So, in brief, a catastrophe for the Labour Party. And many on the doorstep reported that the winter fuel allowance was a major reason why. Speaking personally, when I went to Runcorn ahead of the by-election, it was mentioned by basically everyone. Labour won last year because of the cost of living crisis, they said. And the first thing they do in government is attack benefits and take the winter fuel allowance from 10 million pensioners. Over the weekend, one Labour MP told the Financial Times that it was the party's original sin and a, quote, "whose side are you on" moment that morally defined this government almost straight away. I couldn't agree more. Nor can many others, it turns out. Writing in the Times, Sheffield MP Louise Haigh urged Starmer to reconsider his, quote, self-imposed tax rules that prevent the government raising income tax, VAT or national insurance. She said welfare reforms and the loss of the winter fuel allowance were the primary examples offered as to why the Labour government simply did not look like it understood the people's priorities. And meanwhile, Ros Jones, who was re-elected as Labour mayor for Doncaster last week on a sharply reduced majority, warned after her victory about the damage done by the cuts to PIP and the winter fuel allowance. And even before today, it seemed the government was potentially open to changing its mind. The FT reported this over the weekend. One Labour Party figure said he expected a partial U-turn over the winter fuel cuts before Christmas, with the autumn budget being the most likely moment. Nobody in Downing Street now thinks this was a good idea. They all realise it was a mistake. Every single one of them. For now, they're saying they won't do anything about it. But it feels like not yet, rather than never, they said. But from that same article, it was this excerpt towards the end which really caught my eye. It was something the Treasury had been trying to get away with for ages, said a former senior government figure. They said Morgan McSweeney, then Starmer's head of political strategy, but now chief of staff, pretty much hung his head in his hands when he learned of the decision because he, quote, knew it politically. Bit late for that now, isn't it? And also, maybe this source highlighting Morgan McSweeney's canny instincts, his political acumen, is Morgan McSweeney. Who knows? That's often how it works, folks. Maybe I'm being a little bit too cynical, but I've seen it many a time. And if it is Morgan McSweeney briefing that, or an ally of his, then is the leadership potentially setting up Rachel Reeves as the fall guy ahead of any reverse in policy? Well, there's certainly a precedent in Labour history for precisely that, and a switcheroo in terms of what you're doing. Here's Richard Johnson. He's a lecturer in politics from Queen Mary University. Richard Johnson tweets, "It's embarrassing, but the government should reverse the winter fuel cut." In 1965, Harold Wilson lost a safe seat in a by-election amid pensioner anger over a winter pension freeze. He raised the pension a few weeks later. He learned that he needed to be a politician and not a technician. That's 1965, so 1 year into the Wilson premiership, and he reversed gear. Of course, famously, he went on to win another 3 general elections. Rather successful politician, it turns out. Maybe Keir Starmer could learn from the past. For now, despite the briefings, that seems unlikely. Here's Health Secretary Wes Streeting appearing on Good Morning Britain earlier today.
Well, the message from Number 10 this morning is that the policy's here to stay. I've seen speculation about changes to thresholds and so on, but the message has been clear. And that whether it's winter fuel or employers' national insurance or changes to non-DOMs or the tax breaks for private schools, the reason those decisions have been taken is so that we can do things like invest in our NHS, and it means I can come on this morning and report back on what we're doing.
I just want to pin you down on it, because whenever a government minister says it's very clear, it's quite often not clear. You've said that Number 10 has made it clear that the policy is going to stay, but then you mentioned within the same answer that the threshold might change. Are you simply saying there's speculation the threshold might change, or that there is a possibility that the threshold might change?
No, I was saying I've read the speculative reports in the media this morning, but Downing Street have been very clear that there's no change planned.
Right, no change at all. There's not going to be any change to the policy. So any hope that any pensioners might get their winter fuel payment back, you are ruling that out 100% this morning.
Yeah, no change that I'm aware of, and that's the line that's come from Downing Street this morning as well.
100% ruling it out, no change that I'm aware of. That's the line coming out of Downing Street. You sound like a journalist, Wes. You're not a journalist. You're the health secretary. That's the line coming out of Downing Street, I'm hearing. You're not the political editor of GMB. You work for the government. That's the line coming out of... The line can change, right? The line can change. And I also just find this really remarkable. We're listening, but you're wrong. We're listening, but actually, the money we took away, that £1.4 billion, oh my God, it raised so little money. That £1.4 billion is going to do so much in the NHS. But we're listening. Well, you're not listening. You're saying that the people that have just voted against you, and like I say, they finished fourth in local elections, you're saying they're wrong. You're entitled to do that, of course. You're ploughing on with the plan regardless, but that doesn't sound like listening. Also earlier today, Eluned Morgan, Welsh First Minister and leader of the Welsh Labour Party, made a speech which included overt criticism of budget cuts by the Westminster government, including, of course, the winter fuel allowance. Afterwards, she told The Guardian this: "Time is ticking for us. They've got time to turn things round. We have very little time to turn things around in Wales. So our patience is running out. I'm determined to make a change for the people of Wales, and I haven't got much time. I'm impatient. I need things done. We're tacking to the left here. We're saying that we want to make sure that the centre of gravity in Wales is to the left." We get the point. Time is of the essence. The Welsh First Minister went on to add this: "We all come from families that are complicated these days, and we fall out within our families, but we're still family. We still turn up to each other's weddings and funerals, but in between there may be a bit of a falling out, and that's not the end of the world." There's the analogy for the Labour Party just being a very dysfunctional family. How about you be a functional democratic organisation? That's what you're meant to be. Anyway, all of this, of course, particularly from Morgan, is very much reflecting the fact that we are going to see elections next year that are going to be in so many places right across the country. Because when Morgan says time is ticking, specifically in her case, she means elections to the Welsh Senedd next May. They will be accompanied by elections to Holyrood in Scotland, as well as local elections across the whole of Greater London, every single authority in London, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Birmingham and Newcastle. I think there's going to be 10 mayors up for grabs. It's a lot. If last week's elections were bad for Starmer, and they were, then 2026 could be existential. And one suspects that for Welsh and Scottish Labour, as well as their counterparts in control of major authorities across urban England, reversing the winter fuel allowance decision would be a major step in the right direction. Kieran, Labour have said there'll be no reversal. Easy for them, though, that is to say the central Labour operation and Downing Street have said that. They aren't the ones up for election next year, are they? If you're in Scotland or Wales or Liverpool or Leeds, you're pulling your hair out here.
No, but the consequences will boomerang to them in time as well. I mean, look, every day is a bad news day at the moment, and today is one of them. But seeing Wes Streeting, seeing Wes Streeting squirm is a ray of light in that stormy sky. But I think the lesson here is that people don't like being sold political Ponzi schemes. Right? They don't like being sold political pyramid schemes. Starmerism is a name for something that essentially doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. It was built on two things: the destruction of Corbynism from within, and the total collapse of the Tory government after 14 years in power. And the ideological character, if you like, that emerges from those two shaping forces has completely misread the mood of the nation, particularly the so-called left behind parts of the country. You visited, obviously, some of them ahead of the by-election and so on last week, Aaron. And, you know, the footage that you recorded reflected that. You know, parts of the country that have seen their communities and living standards corroded by deindustrialization. McSweeney Starmerism had a faith that as long as government is culturally right-wing enough in its rhetoric and in its comms, that those communities wouldn't notice that government has absolutely zilch to offer them materially to improve their lives or rebuild their communities or protect them from market forces, all the things that government ought to have been conceived to do, and in most cases is most successful when it does do. And I think worse than that, obviously the context of this conversation, they believed that those communities would be responsive to Whitehall jargon like fiscal spending rules as a justification for cutting the small morsels of support that they do enjoy or did enjoy, i.e. the winter fuel allowance. I've often wondered how easy it would be to squander, or hard it would be to squander £1 billion. Or, I mean, Marlon Brando, American actor, famously squandered like £200 or £300 million in 30 years. And I remember reading that and thinking, how the hell do you do that? But that, in political terms, is what Keir Starmer has managed to do with a majority of 174 in less than a year.
When you put it like that, it's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, the comparisons to Boris Johnson don't really feel fair in a way. And I mean to Boris Johnson. You know, the Tories after 2019 had a majority of about 80. And of course, in those first local elections afterwards, they did really well. They did really well. They won, of course, the Hartlepool by-election, famously. So Starmer's on a much worse trajectory, having started from a much more favourable place than the Tories in 2019. I can't think of any similar trend, any similar collapse happening like this so quickly in contemporary Western history. I can't think of it. I'm sure somebody in the comments will say, oh, the Irish coalition of 2009, or I don't know, this government in the 1980s in Greece, maybe. It doesn't come easily to mind, though. And I think we're looking at something actually really, really significant in terms of the strategy of political communications that has worked basically for the last 40, 50 years is now over. It's gone. Even the idea of get Brexit done, Blair, Miliband, Osborne, just these, we will repeat this same line over and over and over again. You can clearly see the likes of Starmer wedge treating the number 10 outfit coming from that space, and they look ridiculous. And it's something actually I was talking about Michael Walker before we came on air. You look at Farage, he's no longer looked at, and we'll be talking about this in the stream after this show tonight, Michael Ash and I. He's no longer looked at as even a maverick, right? Forget somebody who's being stigmatized and is viewed as beyond the boundaries of permissible debate. He's not even a maverick. He's just kind of normal. He seems normal. Now, you or I might not think that. So a lot of voters out there, particularly younger voters, by the way, actually, people under 40, he just seems normal. And I think that reflects the fact that the, like I say, status quo approach with political communications for the last 40 years is kind of done. You can't just keep repeating the same line, message discipline, and hope it cuts through. You just look and sound ridiculous. That's what happened with Labour on the Tory black hole. They said it with regards to, trying to fix the mess that the Tories left behind. They talked about things like the winter fuel allowance. Hasn't worked. It's been a disaster. All of their proposed tax rises have been a disaster, even the ones I agree with. They've all been a disaster in terms of how they've communicated them, because they haven't had a story behind them. They just say, this is happening. Here's the line. Fix the NHS. That paradigm doesn't seem to be working anymore. Like I say, there will be a stream talking about Farage and reform. Can Nigel Farage really be this country's Prime Minister? That's from 7:30 with Michael, Ash and myself. It's going to be a really, really fascinating debate. Love to know what you think ahead of time. If you have any questions for us, put those in the comments right now. Maybe select one or two really good ones. Although I should say Ash will be leading that conversation. And before I go on to our next story, Kieran, we have to be fair to Labour in so much as last week, the big story was Tory collapse, okay? The Tories lost a ton of councils. I think they lost 10 councils. They lost a ton of councils. They were smashed because, important to repeat this, the authorities that were up for grabs were primarily Conservative voting, okay? They weren't Labour. These weren't Labour authorities. So, okay, Labour aren't going to do very well. They did even worse than you'd expect, but the big story was collapse for the Tories, and I'd be shocked, actually, if Kemi Badenoch is around for another year. Something I said at the start of this story, though, is that, of course, Labour could be facing something similar in May 2026. Just to repeat, elections across the whole of Greater London, all the big urban cities in England, elsewhere too, of course, but in England. And then you've got elections for the Welsh Senedd and Holyrood in Scotland. How do you think those are going to play out? Let's talk about this for 5 minutes. How do you think those elections in 2026 right across the union are going to play out? Can Labour save them? Or should we now price in the fact that that is the next step in the demise and the downfall of Keir Starmer's Labour Party?
You know, the thing about the Tories is, and the reason why I don't think it was really worth talking about them, somewhat counterintuitively, because as you say, Aaron, they were the real losers. I'm going to say something quite flippant that I probably shouldn't say. Who cares? Who cares about the Tories? They're yesterday's news. And that is the point, right? The point is that the Tories were in government for 14 years through various permutations, various prime ministers. They lost catastrophically at the last election after winning improbably 5 years before that, and 5 years before that again. And they're on the scrap heap, and they're trying to reinvent themselves. You know, and whenever I, for my sins, occasionally go on GB News, you can always see the anchor people saying to each other, you can always hear the anchor people sort of susurrating to one another, did you see Kemi Badenoch earlier? Don't you think that was an improvement? And there's always this kind of sluggish will to manifest an improved Tory leadership among them. And you can see that they don't really believe it. And so the Tories are trying to reinvent themselves. They're at that part of the process where they're still in the ash heap and they're trying to find the phoenix. And obviously, the struggle for them as well is that they're being outflanked to the right in the form of reform, which we should talk about in a minute because it relates to your point about 2026. So who cares about the Tories? I mean, we knew that they were going to still be living in the headwinds or among the headwinds that they experienced in 2024 and which tanked them at the general election. The real story is Labour because, as I said before, it's a how to squander £1 billion in a year story. It's a how to squander a 174-seat majority in a year story. Now, I'm not being sensationalist about it. I'm not suggesting that Labour have lost all 174 of those majority seats or 400, whatever it was, of their seats in total. Of course, they will in 2026 cling on to some heartlands. Of course they will. But if all of the polling is accurate, and again, comes with a health warning, you know, we talk a lot about polls, I think to some extent rightly, but it can be overcooked, over-egged. So it comes with a health warning. But if the polling, which is pretty consistent, and actually, by the way, in the middle 2010s, polling really went down the toilet around the time of Brexit and Trump, because psephologists, the people who build the science behind the polls, got things so wrong. There has been a bit of a realignment and a resetting of that supposed science and the profession that it underpins since then. And polls, in simple terms, have got more things right since then. So I don't think we can discredit a consensus among the pollsters that as things stand, and again, it's an important caveat, things could turn around, that Labour are heading for, there are early signs that Labour's heading for annihilation. And I think that is something that every single Labour Party politician at every level of the party and every single strategist in the party and so on will be looking at very, very seriously. Then you have more hard evidence in last week's results. Then you have the anecdotal evidence insofar as, the polling that they conduct internally as a party and the people that they speak to on the doorsteps, and the winter fuel allowance being a massive sticking point. I mean, Aaron, you said that there was scarcely a person you spoke to in Runcorn who didn't just bring it up, whether you prompted them or not. So all of these things together create a perfect storm of electoral decline, essentially, that Labour is very seriously facing. And Harold Wilson, as you used the Harold Wilson example before, well, Harold Wilson not only won 3 more elections, he won the 1966 election with a vastly increased majority. Actually, I think there were 2 elections that were, Anyway, he increased his majority because he was able to reflect on the decisions and he reversed. Now, in order to do that, Downing Street has to jettison this synthetic, self-imposed, jargony fiscal rule stuff that Rachel Reeves' chancellorship and Number 11 want to impose on the Labour Party like a straitjacket. Well, if they continue to go down that line and if they continue to work only within the confines of the so-called fiscal rules, then they will turn electoral decline into electoral annihilation. I'm absolutely certain of it, precisely because the strategy as it was conceived 2-3 years ago, as I said before, was built on the destruction of Corbynism from within, and it was just built on the collapse of the Tories from without. And those 2 things worked. They worked in getting them over the line. But now they look like a Ponzi scheme because they don't have anything to offer neighbourhoods, communities, places like Runcorn and many, many, many others up and down the country that are crying out for some form of economic renewal, some form of communitarian, materialistic renewal. It doesn't even need to be left-wing necessarily. And that's why you see Reform hoovering that sentiment up, metabolizing it and turning it into what looks like a fairly formidable, if nascent, electoral machine.
Yeah, I agree with lots of that. Just to be clear, because we like the facts here at Novara Media, there was one general election in 1966. Wilson gets in 64, I think with two seats majority, wins in a landslide in 66. There are 2 elections in 74, which of course Wilson gets over the line in the latter one. And I think he goes in 76. He hands the baton over to Jim Callaghan, who of course loses for Labour in 79 against Margaret Thatcher. So just the one in 66. But it's a really important point. You make a big error within a year of taking office. You're Harold Wilson. You change course, and a year later you're rewarded with a landslide. I mean, I don't think Keir Starmer's going to do that, is he? But it's certainly one to think about. It's happened before. Before we go on to the next story, I would just say this. I think Labour are going to get smashed in Scotland, smashed in Wales. I think Reform are going to pick up a ton of places in the Senate. They may even be the largest party in the Senate. They may be. And I think you're going to see just a sprawl of emerging independents and, of course, the Green Party right across the major cities. And in places like Lancashire and Yorkshire too, you're going to see a lot of independents in the West Mids as well. And we're going to see a real fragmenting of Labour's vote, which I think in terms of trying to understand what happens in the next general election, that's much more significant than what we've just seen. Of course, 12 months away, who knows? But I think things will be getting very interesting this time in 2026. Help us cover all of that stuff really well, let you know the facts, and maybe, just maybe, push the dial a little bit to the left, support our work. Go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. Reform have GB News. Maybe the next left populist outfit in this country has Novara Media. Who knows? Help us get there. We're not here for 1 year, 2 years, or even a decade. We're here for the long term. That's what we need to shift politics in this country. Like I say, if you want to support our work, the link is in the description below. The leader of Germany's centre-right Christian Democratic Party, Friedrich Merz, has become the country's new chancellor. But it wasn't a walk in the park, with Germany's parliament, the Bundestag, having to go to a second vote before it awarded him the country's top job. In a humiliating turn of events, Merz failed to secure the majority he needed to become Germany's leader in the first vote, becoming instead the first candidate since the end of the Second World War to be rejected by the Bundestag. The vote for the new chancellor is done by secret ballot, with Merz needing 316 of Germany's 630 MPs to vote for him. In the first round of voting, only 310 did, leaving Merz 6 votes short of a victory. That's an embarrassing result, but the details are even more telling when it comes to the future stability of Germany's government. Merz's party, the CDU, has managed to form a coalition with the last party of government, Olaf Scholz's Social Democratic Party. Together, they have 328 seats in the Bundestag. But because Merz only got 310 votes in the first ballot, that would mean at least 18 of Merz's own coalition members voted against him. That's hardly the most auspicious sign. Not the best start, is it? And Merz's political opponents were quick to make political capital out of all of this. The far-right Alternative for Deutschland, or AfD, co-led by Alice Weidel, came second in the country's February elections, taking 150 seats in the parliament. That's nearly a quarter of the total. Posting online after Merz's shock failure to win the chancellorship in the first round, Weidel said this: "As the AfD, we have set out to turn this country upside down. We're ready for government responsibility, and we call for common sense to prevail. Mr. Merz should resign immediately." Resign from what? Chancellor for a day. The way it should be paved for new elections in our country. In the end, Merz won out, but only just. After a frantic second vote, he got 325 votes, 9 more than he needed. Though it still means that at least 3 members of his own coalition voted against him. Hardly a resounding vote of confidence in the new chancellor, but it at least puts to bed the possibility of fresh elections for now. At present, a return to the ballot box in Germany would only serve the AfD, taking them, in all likelihood, even closer to power. Last month, the AfD became the top choice for German voters in a major poll. The first time the party has outflanked the mainstream parties on both the centre-right, that's the CDU, and the centre-left, the SPD. 25% of Germans said they would vote for the far-right party if an election was held. But an agreement between other German parties, known as the Firewall, means that none will work with the AfD to form a government. Now, back in January, Merz bent that rule just a little bit. He tried to pass a contentious migration bill by lobbying for the votes of the far right. That ploy backfired after members of his own party refused to pass the law over Merz's collaboration with the AfD. Despite their growing popularity in Germany, the AfD suffered a blow last week. The party was officially designated an extremist right-wing party by the German security services. Following a 3-year investigation, German intelligence published an 1,100-page report into the party's activities, rather thoroughly German, 1,100 pages, concluding that the AfD poses a threat to Germany's democratic order. In the report, the agency says this: "Central to our assessment is the ethnically and ancestrally defined concept of the people that shapes the AfD, which devalues entire segments of the population in Germany and violates their human dignity. This concept is reflected in the party's overall anti-migrant and anti-Muslim stance." No other party with federal representation in the Bundestag has ever been classified as extremist in Germany's post-war history. The designation will give Germany's intelligence services additional powers to surveil the party using wiretaps, undercover agents, and digital tools. But it doesn't stop the AfD from forming coalitions or running in elections. In Parliament, questions have been raised over whether the AfD, again, the country's second largest party, should be allowed to chair parliamentary committees. Some lawmakers have suggested that the AfD and their members should not be allowed to have jobs in the civil service or local government, and should indeed be banned from owning firearms. Others have called for a full ban on the party. Of course, it's pretty difficult to ban a party that 25% of the country say they want to vote for as the government. Some AfD supporters overseas have been outraged by the decision. US Vice President J.D. Vance also weighed in. He said this: "The AfD is the most popular party in Germany and by far the most representative of East Germany. Now the bureaucrats try to destroy it. The West tore down the Berlin Wall together, and it has been rebuilt, not by the Soviets or the Russians, but by the German establishment." That's a reference to the fact that the AfD owes its greatest support to former East German states like Saxony and Thuringia, rural constituencies which are also amongst the poorest in the country. And meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio also chipped in, earning a sharp response for the German Foreign Office. This was the exchange online. "Germany just gave its spy agency new powers to surveil the opposition. That's not democracy, it's tyranny in disguise. Of course, the Americans would never do that. What is truly extremist is not the popular AfD, which took second in the recent election, but rather the establishment's deadly open border immigration policies that the AfD opposes. Germany should reverse course." The German Foreign Office at Germany Diplo replied, "This is democracy. This decision is the result of a thorough and independent investigation. to protect our constitution and the rule of law. It is independent courts that will have the final say. We have learned from our history that right-wing extremism needs to be stopped just a little bit. Germany, we've learned from our history that, you know what? Right-wing extremism, sometimes it can end badly. The AfD has now filed a lawsuit against that classification. Kieran, isn't it fascinating? You have American politicians like J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio. When it comes to things like abortion, I can't get involved in this or that state because states' rights. When it comes to a literal foreign country overseeing its own independent legal processes, they want to be involved. Explain this to me.
Well, I mean, in that particular instance, and with that example given, I don't think that Marco Rubio or JD Vance really believe in very much, actually, fundamentally. I think that those things are often used as politically expedient stepping stones for a political career. I'm sure they have some core values, but and they tell themselves that they hold them very dearly and so on, but they were not so dearly that they're not willing to be utter hypocrites when it's politically expedient or feeds a narrative that is suitable and advantageous to them. Having said all of that, Aaron, and I wonder if we're going to have a debate about this. I'm unsure. I'm genuinely unsure. I find myself in the very strange position of agreeing with Marco Rubio and JD Vance for, I'm sure, completely different, I hope, completely different reasons. Generally, I'm very against the establishment interfering in this way in all but very clear cases of attempted democratic or legal subversion. In all but very clear cases. And I haven't read the 11,000 or whatever it was page document about this and on the AfD compiled by the German state. But I am not convinced that this is one such instance. I'm against it. I despise everything the AfD stands for. Their utopia is my dystopia and so on. But I don't think this sort of thing ever really works. I don't think any disillusioned voter ever said, what about those guys I voted for? The judges and bureaucrats took them out of the game and now I have to find someone else to vote for, no one else to vote for. Okay, well, I tried at least. It just doesn't happen. I don't think you can suppress in the body politic the impulses that give rise to the likes of the AfD. And if you do, it usually produces, historically, it typically produces two responses. One, organizing outside of the party political structures. So civil society groups at best, paramilitaries at worst. And two, it pulls the other parties rightward because there is a pool of discontent for them to capitalize on. So they absorb and metabolize the ideas and by extension votes of the eliminated party, right? Typically that's what tends to happen. And I get why they're doing it. Obviously, we all get why they're doing it. You don't have to know anything about politics really to understand that they're scared of their own history and they're scared of coalitions and they're scared of underestimating the far right. I get it. But there's another history that they need to think about, which is not the 1930s, 20s and 30s, but the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Because almost all of the increases, not all, but almost all of the major increases in the AfD's vote came from the old east of the country, as you mentioned, Darren. So areas that have been economically left behind, most obviously, that have catching up to do in terms of their economic development, have suffered recession or at the sharp end of recession when it blights the German economy. But they also have a sense about government and the state. And whenever we're not going to relitigate, the German Democratic Republic and East Germany and so on. But I think that really seriously needs to be taken into account. So there are twin histories at play here, twin histories speaking through these events. And that needs to be considered, not just the 1930s and running scared from the 1930s at the cost of everything else, like we see, by the way, Germany doing with Palestine and with Israel. we're terrified of our own history. We're terrified of the fact we committed genocide in the 1940s. Let's give them a green card. Let's give them a carte blanche or a green light to commit genocide in 2025. It doesn't make any sense. I'm going to end on I wasn't sure if I was going to do this, but I used to be accused of using too many long words on Novara Live. I'm sure I still do. But I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, use the mother of all long words quickly, because there is a German word that is completely ridiculous and unnecessary. Verschlimmbesserung. And it means an attempt to make something better that only makes the situation worse. And I'm sure I've mispronounced that. Completely happy to be crucified on my pronunciation. It seemed too fitting to not use. So Verschlimmbesserung, what they're trying to do is improve the situation by closing down the channels of the AFD or the channels available to the AFD. I worry it will make things worse.
Verschlimmbesserung, is that what you say? Okay. A long word in English is anti-disestablishmentarianism. I think that's the longest word in the English language. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know. We do sort of disagree, I suppose, in a way. I agree that banning the party would have catastrophic political consequences, but it is a hallmark of a democracy that you do have the regime saying, we're going to wiretap the phones of this party because of X, Y, Z reasons. I mean, that happens in other countries. That happens in the US, right? That happens in the UK. It happened in the UK. They just don't send out a press release. I think that's quite commendable in a way. And if there's also concerns about AFD members having access to firearms and so on, I mean, this is clearly quite high stakes. I agree that stopping them from being able to stand in elections is unwise. And you're seeing something similar in France, of course. That's happened to Marine Le Pen. That's been condemned by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, Yanis Varoufakis, for precisely the same reasons you just outlined. And she's just been replaced by Jordan Bardella, who may win anyway. You see it in Romania. The populist candidate allegedly backed by the Russians. They got rid of him. There's a new populist who's just won the first round. So I agree with you that as a tactic, just blocking parties or people from standing doesn't work. But I think openly saying that you're going to investigate or wiretap members of a political party for X, Y, Z reasons, I think saying that's quite significant. And also, if this is JD Vance's opinion on German politics and the democratic process in Germany, how does he view the history of the democratic process in the United States? When the CIA was doing wiretaps of people like Fred Hampton, or when he was killed by American police officers. Who does he think killed JFK? I'm pretty sure it was the CIA and probably the mafia, but just me. Maybe Donald Trump will let us know before the end of this presidency. Kieran, I had an incredibly sore throat, but we made it. Thanks for joining me this evening.
We made it. I think my throat started to go as well. So we could have been really in a lot of trouble. So, congratulations to us for crawling to the end. But no, the adrenaline carried us through. It was a great discussion. Thanks, Aaron.
They're great stories and they're big stories, right? I'm just thinking about that, AFD, Le Pen, reform. Wow, what an extraordinary period for European politics in particular. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Like I said at the start of the show, don't go anywhere. We are doing a special Q&A on the rise of reform from 7:30. So half an hour, get a cup of tea ready, a few digestive biscuits, and come right back. Very important conversation. Could Nigel Farage be this country's prime minister? I wouldn't rule it out personally. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.